These 4 stories are about to ruin your sense of safety. From mirrors that steal souls to glitches in the elevator, you won't be sleeping tonight. Smash that like button and subscribe right now if you're brave enough for more. Let's dive in. The Glass Cage and the Porcelain Guest. They say the problem with antiques isn't that they're old, it's that they're heavy. They carry the weight of every pair of eyes that ever looked into them. And in New Orleans, some things don't just reflect the world, they trap it. Clara was a hunter of haunted chic. Her apartment was a curated gallery of thrift store scores, but the centerpiece was a massive Victorian floor mirror she'd salvaged from a collapsing estate in the Garden District. The silver backing was oxidizing, turning the edges into a misty, bruised gray. To complete the look, she'd placed a vintage porcelain doll she'd found at the same estate on a velvet chair, directly opposite the glass. The doll wore a tattered lace baptismal gown, and its oversized glass eyes had the exact same murky, clouded tint as the mirror. The glitches started small. While brushing her teeth, Clara saw her jewelry box open in the reflection. When she spun around, the lid was snapped shut. She laughed, blaming the humid Louisiana heat and the dim amber lighting. But then the doll began to move, only in the glass. In the reflection, the doll wasn't sitting on the chair anymore. It was standing by the bathroom door. Then, a night later, it was sitting at the foot of the reflected bed. In the real room, the doll never moved an inch, but its painted lips seemed to be stretching into a tighter, thinner line every morning. Last Tuesday, the southern silence broke. As Clara applied her lipstick, her reflection simply stopped. Mirror Clara froze, even as the real Clara leaned in. Then the reflection did something impossible. It reached out and took the doll's hand, the doll that, in the reflection, was now standing right beside her. In the real room, the porcelain doll's head snapped to 180 degrees with a sickening ceramic crack, locking its dead eyes onto Clara's face. Panic surged. Clara scrambled back toward the mirror, but the glass didn't show her retreating. It showed her double and the doll climbing into her bed, pulling up the Egyptian cotton sheets. Clara turned to her actual bed. It was empty, but there was a freshly cut lock of her own hair lying on the pillow. She realized then the mirror wasn't a reflection. It was a replacement. She grabbed a heavy brass lamp to shatter the glass, but a cold, impossibly strong grip clamped onto her wrist. It was the doll. The porcelain fingers bit into her skin like a vice. It wasn't a toy anymore. It had the weight of a corpse. In the mirror, Mirror Clara sat up in bed and looked out at the real Clara with a look of terrifying pity. Suddenly, an invisible force slammed Clara against the mirror. She expected the impact of glass, but she felt her face pass through a cold, gelatinous membrane. She stumbled out onto a floor that felt like frozen smoke. She looked back through the window and saw her own bedroom, vibrant, warm, and alive. Her double was standing there, looking healthy and radiant. Beside her, the doll was sitting on the bed, but its porcelain skin was beginning to flush with a warm pink glow. It was becoming soft. It was becoming flesh. The real girl picked up a claw hammer from the toolkit under the bed. She looked Clara in the eye with a predatory Southern Belle smile. "Thank you for the trade, honey," the double whispered. It was so cold in the dark. The hammer swung. The glass exploded. Clara didn't fall onto the hardwood floor. She fell into a silent, pressurized void. The last thing she heard was her own voice in the real world, humming a low Creole lullaby as her double tucked the new girl into bed and turned off the light, leaving Clara trapped in the jagged shards of a broken memory. Elevators are simple machines. They go up, they go down. But in the oldest buildings, the wiring gets tangled with things that aren't on the blueprints. Mark lived in a 1920s apartment complex in downtown Seattle. The elevator was a cage-style relic with the manual gate that groaned every time it moved. One rainy Thursday, Mark was coming back from a late shift. He pressed the button for the 5th floor. The elevator hummed, but instead of the usual jolt, it slowed down smoothly. The floor indicator didn't show 5. It flickered and settled on a handwritten 4.5. The gate slid open. Mark expected to see a brick wall, but instead he saw a hallway. It looked exactly like his floor, but the wallpaper was a sickly, faded yellow, and the air smelled like old ozone and wet concrete. Curious, he stepped out. The door slammed shut behind him. Mark turned back, but there was no elevator, just a solid yellow wall. He began to walk. The hallway was silent except for the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of fluorescent lights that flickered in a pattern he couldn't quite catch. He passed doors, but they had no handles. No numbers, just flat wood painted the same dull yellow as the walls. After 10 minutes of walking, he found a stairwell. He ran up one flight, expecting the 5th floor. He opened the door only to find the exact same yellow hallway. He ran down 2 flights, the same hallway. Panic set in. He started screaming for help, but his voice didn't echo. It felt like the walls were absorbing the sound, deadening it before it could reach the end of the corridor. He found a small table in the middle of the hall, the only piece of furniture he'd seen. On it sat a dusty logbook. Mark opened it. The pages were filled with names, dates, and times. The entries went back decades. As he flipped to the last page, his heart stopped. The final entry was written in fresh, wet ink. Mark, arrival 11:42. PM status permanent. He looked at his watch. It was 11:42 p.m. The second's hand wasn't moving. It was twitching back and forth, trapped in the same millisecond. From the far end of the hallway, he heard it, the faint, rhythmic clink, clink, clink of an elevator gate opening. He ran toward the sound, desperate to catch it, but as he rounded the corner, he saw himself. Another Mark was stepping out of an elevator cage, looking confused, wearing the same wet coat. The new Mark looked at the old Mark with horror. Before Mark could reach the gate, it slammed shut. The elevator vanished. Mark stood alone in the yellow silence. He looked down at the logbook. He picked up the pen. He realized he didn't want to leave anymore. He just wanted someone else to talk to. He turned the page and waited for the next person to press the button for the 5th floor. Wax figures are designed to look alive, but the real nightmare starts when they actually begin to behave that way. At the Old Town Wax Museum, and the night shift has one rule: never count the figures twice. Ethan was a guy who didn't believe in ghosts. That's why he took the night watchman job at the local museum. It was an easy paycheck, just walk through the galleries, check the locks, and wait for sunrise. The manager gave him a small notebook and a warning. The tally for room 1 is 12, room 2 is 15, room 3 is 8. Write it down, check it once. If you count them a second time, you might not like the math. At 2 a.m., Ethan entered room 1, the Victorian era exhibit. He felt a bit nervous, so he counted them just to calm his nerves. 1, 2, 3, 12. Everything was correct. The figures stood frozen in their silk dresses and top hats, their glass eyes staring into nothing. An hour later, bored and restless, Ethan found himself back in room 1. He forgot the warning. He pointed his flashlight and started counting again. 10, 11, 12. He stopped. There was a man in a black tuxedo standing in the far corner, half hidden by a heavy velvet curtain. 13, Ethan whispered. His blood ran cold. He checked his notebook. The number 12 was written in thick black ink. He looked back at the corner. The man in the tuxedo was gone. Ethan sprinted to the security office and locked the door. He frantically pulled up the live feed for room 1. The camera showed the room was empty of movement, but as he scanned the screen, he noticed that all 12 figures had turned their heads. They weren't looking at the camera, they were all looking at the door Ethan had just run through. Then a movement caught his eye on the monitor for room 2. A figure was walking, not like a human, but with a stiff, jerky motion like wood scraping against stone. It was the man in the tuxedo. He was moving toward the office. Ethan grabbed his radio. "Hello, is someone there?" The radio crackled. A voice came through, but it didn't sound like a voice. It sounded like the rubbing of wax paper. "You counted us, Ethan. Now we have to count you." The office door rattled. Ethan looked at the small window in the door. The man in the tuxedo was standing there. But up close, Ethan could see the truth. The figure had no face. It was just smooth, unformed wax, except for a pair of real human eyes that were blinking rapidly. Ethan backed into the corner of the office, but he felt something hard and cold behind him. He turned around. Standing inside the small office was a 14th figure. It was a perfect wax replica of Ethan himself, wearing his uniform, holding a replica of his flashlight. The replica reached out and touched Ethan's arm. Ethan tried to scream, but his jaw felt heavy, stiff. He looked down at his hands and saw them turning yellow and translucent. The next morning, the manager arrived and opened room 1. He checked his notebook. Room 1? Tally is 12. Everything is in order. He walked past a new figure in the corner, a young man in a security uniform, whose expression was frozen in a scream so realistic that the tourists would later comment on the incredible craftsmanship of the artist. National parks have strict trails for a reason. Not to keep you from getting lost, but to keep you from finding the things that don't belong in nature. Liam was an experienced hiker who loved off-trail trekking in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. He prided himself on his navigation skills, but deep in the heart of the Olympic Peninsula, he found something that wasn't on any map. In the middle of a pristine, ancient grove, there was a staircase. No house, no ruins, no foundation. Just a set of clean, white-carpeted stairs rising 10 feet into the air, ending in a small wooden landing. It looked like it had been ripped out of a modern suburban home and dropped into the moss. Liam remembered the stories, the warnings from veteran rangers. If you see a staircase in the woods, don't go near it, don't touch it, and whatever you do, don't climb it. But the silence of the forest was hypnotic. There were no birds, no wind, just the staircase standing there like a challenge. Liam felt an unnatural pull. His legs moved before his brain could protest. As he stepped onto the first stair, the forest behind him vanished. The green trees turned into a blur of gray static. By the third step, he couldn't hear his own breathing. The air became thin and smelled of artificial lavender and vacuum dust. He reached the top landing. From here, he didn't look down at the forest. He looked down into a living room. His living room. He saw his wife sitting on the sofa, scrolling through her phone. He saw his dog sleeping by the fireplace. He called out her name, but no sound left his throat. He tried to step off the landing into the room, but his foot hit an invisible barrier. It was like looking through a window that wouldn't open. Then he saw himself. A version of Liam walked into the living room on the other side of the glass. This Liam looked tired, wearing the same hiking gear, covered in the same mud. The other Liam sat down next to his wife, kissed her cheek, and looked directly up at the ceiling, directly at where the real Liam was standing on the staircase. The other Liam winked. Panic flared. Liam turned to run back down the stairs, but the staircase was gone. He was standing on a wooden platform suspended in a white, endless void. There was no forest, no ground. He looked back down into the living room. The other Liam was now standing up, holding a hatchet he usually kept in the garage. He began to slowly walk toward the stairs in the house that led to the bedrooms. Liam screamed, pounding on the invisible floor, watching his life being stolen by something that came out of the woods. But in the real world, the only thing the dog heard was a faint, high-pitched whistle, like wind catching a crack in a door. On the forest floor, the white staircase shimmered once and vanished, leaving only a patch of dead, white grass where it had stood. Which one hit you the hardest? 1, 2, 3, or 4? Let me know in the comments. If you made it to the end, drop a like and share this with the friend you want to terrify today. Subscribe to survive the next nightmare. See you in the dark.